notice the typo. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between is NFA LD Debate Sensei. We talk about things relevant to NFA LD competition, and we got something special this episode. As always, I have Dr. Justin Kirk from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thank you very much. But we also have two guests that are going to discuss proposals that are being put forward and offer a little bit of context of what we're talking about. We have Shanna Carlson from Illinois State University and Shawna Merrill from Illinois College. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Excellent, excellent. So we've been, me and Justin have been talking about this episode coming up for a little while, and it's one of those things that's kind of like a full sort of year in progress type of thing where people like, you know, brainstorm and put things together and it starts forming. And now we're at that point in which these things are being put forward. And got a couple of things that we're going to talk about. I think one of them might be shorter than the other, but thank you very much. Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
So the first one you were telling me just a second ago. So something really quick is that oftentimes when rules are made in committee, there are oversights that happen, and you don't catch them several years later, maybe when they're trying to be applied. You know what? I think I'm going to ask Shanna. I see your nonverbals even more pronounced. Can you explain what's going on?
Yeah. So like, oversights or accidental wordings are also really common for NFA that we catch like years later, because we do have speech events and debate events, and NFA really tries to look at both styles as kind of one overarching thing of forensics. Mm-hmm. So we try to keep standards of who can go to elims, what special rounds do we do, what things do we give. We try to keep that as equivalent as possible for everyone that's involved in the activity. And so one of the things that NFA has really been trying to work on is encouraging novice participation and really growing that younger base. And celebrating the students that are extremely willing to go out of their box, especially if they've never done speech or debate before, and jump into that at some point in their college career. And so we're wanting to be able to have more students that qualify as novices to be able to participate in novice elim rounds. And so the way it's written, the rule is like you have to break at least 4 that are eligible, which for us in a 1v1 competition would mean a semifinals and then a final. Right. In speech, one round includes 6 people, right? So for them, when they break to semifinals, that's actually breaking 12.
Right.
This is from the up to 12 from the overall entry. But for debate, it's a little different because of how many people are involved. So the current bylaws say we'll break at least 4, and then we have another one that's like the proportionality. Cool. That makes sense. You have to be qualified, all that good stuff. And then third is that we will break no more than semifinals.
Right. Okay.
Which artificially caps us.
So okay, like is this because like NFA LD as an event, was that like added later? Was LD added to NFA after some of the other events? Is that, you think that might be possible?
So. Okay. Yeah, in the lore, I believe that's correct.
It's amazing how like our speech and debate communities, like a lot of our history is still oral. You know what I mean? Like we don't have a lot of this written. This is part of the reason I kind of do this, is so like we kind of like get something down. You know what I mean? That you could reference later on and stuff. That Absolutely. Is amazing. Okay, it seems like this rule has been in place for a while. How is it now coming up and being recognized as a problem? Shawna, you look like you might know.
Yeah, so I think that, like Shanna said, we've been having a lot more conversations as a community about getting novices involved. I think that our novice, I mean, I don't have any data, but like I feel like the numbers have been dwindling a bit. And so there's just that emphasis on, you know, novice competition. And for the past several years, so at NFA, there's one division for debate, right? Like there's not a novice division at the national tournament.
Okay.
All of our invitational tournaments, they, as long as there's enough entries, there's a novice, at least novice and open, and we try to do novice, JV, and open. And so, like, you know, the novice debaters qualify during the year in the novice division, and then they go to NFA nationals and absolutely get clobbered.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's been discussion about like a novice division at nationals, and I think that's wonderful. I would love to see that happen. But in the meantime, I think it should, you know, we would like to be able to advance more than just 4 students. I know, just personal anecdote, last year at nationals, my novice was number 5.
Oh no.
So I got very excited when I saw the first 2 criteria, and then that 3rd criteria that said like no more than semifinals. My heart broke again.
Oh, right. Okay, and so that like you actually experienced sort of like one of the blowbacks or outcomes. Yeah. What's your role in all this, Justin?
So I used to kind of serve in the role that Shawna is serving in now, which means I was the former LD rep for the NFA National Committee. And so I was in charge of kind of organizing rule changes from other folks. I was part of like one big wave of amendments and changes that happened a few years ago. So I went through the process once trying to compile in conjunction with a student representative, which I don't know that y'all have. Do y'all have anybody on the student side working, right? You do? That's excellent.
Oh, good.
I was working with a student from Penn State to kind of come up with constitutional changes. One of those changes added a rep from LD's student body onto the National Council, which was something that LD never had. The speech always had a student rep. LD never did. We added that. So like accessibility accommodations for the national tournament, basically putting the onus on the national tournament to provide accessibility instead of debaters to like have to ask for those things. The tournament has to provide certain levels of accessibility, and then a series of a little bit of cleanup, right? There were some places where we needed to clean up some of the rules like Shanna and Shawna are working on now. And then some other kind of like just changes of things that me and some other folks in the community thought had kind of become like lapsed norms. People no longer enforce them as norms. And so having them as rules seemed almost counter to the fact that the community had moved on from them. So I did a little bit of that work back in the day. I'm primarily here as a like, you know, hey, watch out for these landmines in the rulemaking process, and just to provide some advice.
Okay. So this one seems like, I mean, I don't see like there being different schools of thought on this, right? People are like, oh yeah, I see how that was it over.
Not that we've seen. There's been pretty, a vocal chorus of folks being like, more novice opportunity.
Right.
Well, and especially because we have teams that are like that are community colleges, so they have a large number, right, of true novices, so kids that didn't do anything. And then, you know, this is my first year of having more than one true novice on my squad. We have 3, which is new for ISU. We usually have people that have some kind of debate experience, right? So,
and we've got our first 2 novices in like 4 years.
Yeah, I was going to say so that, and these are all kids, at least in mine, that have come to me to be like, I heard about this thing and it sounds fun. And I'm like, okay, it's going to be a lot of work. I want you to do it. I'm here to help you. And so being able to have something that is like an actual super achievable goal of being like, be in the top more than 4.
Like quarterfinalists or something like that.
Quarterfinalists or whatever of, you know, the people that are in your division that you're all on a level playing field, I think just gives us a chance to celebrate more students. Give them more rounds. As a novice, the best thing you can do is debate. yeah, the more you learn, right? The faster you learn, the more you pick up on stuff. And then also sometimes we can get crowds, not crowds, but we can get some more people to go watch those rounds that are like speech people maybe or something like that, because they're a much more accessible round than some of our varsity rounds can be.
Right.
So I think it also just helps the activity and helps, you know, everyone that's involved in NFA access all that NFA can offer in just an easier way.
Okay.
I also think it's important, like, I mean, it's nice to have a successful competitive novice season, but then ending the season on a really tough nationals, you know, experience isn't ideal. And so I'm a little bit the other end of the spectrum as Justin and Shanna. I coach nothing but true novices.
I was going to ask, Illinois College would be a community college, right?
Yeah. So, well, we are a 4-year.
We're
actually not a community college, but we're like a private school. No, you're totally fine. Happens all the time. But yeah, no, like for whatever reason in this area of Illinois, I mean, I'm in the cornfields and so this is my 7th year here in this role, and I believe I've had 2 students who had prior experience. Like I coach nothing but true novices, and so yeah, like I definitely want to see that accessibility expand for novices.
I mean, like I teach, I'm at a community college, and so I teach pretty much nothing but novices. It's like we're recruiting a new team every year, you know what I mean? So I feel you. Now the other proposal that you put forward, that one, at least, you know, of course, I don't know what the background is, but that one seems like it might have a little bit more different schools of thought, especially like how to phrase things and how to come about it. You were telling me about the way evidence is cited. And so I'm not an expert in NFA LD, but I do remember reading the rules when I first started coaching and trying to get people involved in it. And I came across that rule about citing evidence was very explicit about what you were supposed to include. So how has that changed, and what is the proposal to change it, I guess, is the question.
I guess I can kind of start this one off because it was more I got a bee in my bonnet one day when I was reading evidence and got annoyed and was like, okay, something has to change so that there's a little bit of standardization, right? So citations, yes, are very explicit that you have to have all of these aspects to be considered a full citation. Mm-hmm. That's great. But when you get into comparing what the other standards for debate evidence are for NFA to other forms of evidentiary-based debate, such as policy, NDT, CETA, we lack clarity. And that's my big thing, is that I've been around at ISU since 2013 now. I don't know how many different newer coaches, and this is not a complaint. I love that they reach out to me and they ask me questions. So don't take this as a complaint. That's not, but are like, what are the expectations of evidence? What does it need to look like? How do you do it? What is involved? What's approved? What's okay to use? What's not okay to use? And I will answer those questions till the end of the day, but it just gets repetitive. And it would be really nice if I could be like, read page 45 in the document. It lays it out. What questions do you have about the specific subpoints, right? So that I could be more tailored in how I help. But so we don't have any rule against omitting paragraphs in between other paragraphs. So you could cut paragraph, you could copy paste paragraph 1. Technically you could put an ellipsis to identify that you've left a portion out, and then you can do another paragraph, right? And leave out whatever. And so you lose all of that content and that ability in the round, right? To skim it to make sure that nothing's out of context. Someone hasn't taken something that says this will not do this to this will do this. Right. Whether intentional, unintentional, accidental, purposeful, right? And so we're trying to make that like you can't do that anymore. You have to all intermediary paragraphs need to be included. You can shrink the font, right? Like that's fine. What are some other ones, Shawna? My brain's gone.
Right.
I mean,
So
like,
intermediary, like what? And so if somebody were to cut two different cards, they would just have to create like a new claim, or is like
no, it's like if you're going to cut one card, right?
okay,
And you're going to use paragraph 1 and paragraph 8.
yeah,
Right? You need paragraph 2 through 7 also included. But you can take the font from size 12, shrink
right.
it to 8 or smaller or whatever.
Okay.
But just so that I could, if I wanted to, or if a debater wanted to, can very easily check for context.
Okay.
The reason this is so important for me is I have found this is over 10 years, right?
Yes,
or 12
yes.
years. So, but I've come across things that are taken out of context when you read the other paragraphs. And it's like, this is not the conclusion of the author that you're selling as a conclusion.
Right.
I've even seen claims that are highlighted in evidence contradicted by the article title in the citation.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And so even just express rules saying like, you may not, intentionally misrepresent, or not even, like you may not misrepresent the author's, whatever.
Yeah. Right.
There was a card one time I was reading it around, and the argument the card was supposedly making was from a publication that would not have published this on their worst day.
Right.
I was just like, that's not coming out in that newspaper ever, period. And so I went and looked at the article, and sure enough, it was clipped before the conclusion of the article where it was like, this is what some people say.
Yeah.
Opponents disagree, and that's the conclusion. And so this is, it's not super common, but it happens.
It's for me, when I come across it, I know that I reach out to coaches and I'm like, hey, y'all need to check this.
Yeah.
It happens sometimes more often with back files, right? Where that were cut back in, who knows who cut it?
Yeah.
Who knows who made it? Who knows when it was made at this point? And it's just
a lot of high schoolers come in with high school files, come in with camp files, come in with case list files. Chain of custody.
2 a.m. cutting. They're not reading. They're not all together there. Yeah. So, all right.
Yeah. So we're not. The goal is absolutely not to tell people you can only use this list of sources. You can only use these types of things. It's just whatever you use. Here are the ethical, or here are what we think would be the most ethical and academic way to use them and create a level playing field for everybody.
Right. I think a forensics association, declaring is like, all right, this is our stance on what is good evidence and good use of evidence seems responsible. Seems like what you're supposed to, it's something that ought to be clarified, because what's the purpose of the National Forensics Association? If we're supposed to be fostering excellence in these things, is so what are our standards? What do we all agree on, and things like that? And so where else are you going to codify that other than the bylaws and constitution, right? If someone like me, who's not necessarily a member of the community, I'm like, all right, what are they all about? I'm going to look it up, right? I'm going to check it out.
There was a very similar discussion that happened last year at NFA, maybe it was 2 years ago, about what the rules define. It was 2 years ago. What was defined as a prop?
Yeah.
And there was a large discussion about whether or not a second black book brought out from something else was the definition of a prop, and you're not allowed to use props, right? And so forensics has a very strict and specific definition of what counts and doesn't count as a prop, and what you are and are not allowed to use. And I think what Shanna and Shawna are doing here is very similar. Let's create something we can point to and say, this is not evidence.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But that's the thing I'm reminded of, is that was a very intense debate of definition and looking at the rules and what happened in the round. And no, they did not meet the definition of prop, or yes, they did. That's what I think the intent behind these is to have somewhere for coaches and students to go if there is a complaint.
Yeah.
I also think that right now, we've been having a lot of discussions about an identity crisis. Who are we as NFA LD, and how do we differentiate ourselves from other formats of debate? And for me, evidence is a really crucial part of that. So that's what makes us different than Parley, for example, where evidence, you might cite something that you came up with during prep time in an extemp style, but there's no way to fact check that. There's no verifiable evidence in the round in front of us. And so the way that we utilize evidence in LD is something that has to be very fundamental to who we are as an organization and activity. So codifying that is really, really important.
Okay. So I'm assuming though that this is a lot more complicated than just agreeing in principle on these things, right? You know what I mean? I think it's easy to do that. For instance, the reading of evidence. When I was, coaching in this, many people were using that as voters in the round. It's well, you didn't say the date, you lose. You know what I mean? It's you violated the rules type of thing. I'm assuming that there's probably some difficult discussions about enforcement of this. Is there, what are people saying, or what are you thinking, or hash it out right now? That's my first thought. It's okay, the principle, I think everyone agrees on the principle. It's always the enforcement that's tricky.
So it kind of goes back to, I think before Justin and Shawna were part of NFA, or very early in their career, there was a time at NFA where 2 separate debaters were actually disqualified from the national tournament after a very long tournament committee meeting that occurred based on evidence being taken out of context or not cited appropriately or something. So a judge from one, or a student, or a coach from one school went and made a complaint, and then the school that had a complaint, they issued their own complaint as well on another piece of evidence, and so it kind of just snowballed. And unfortunately, these 2 students were removed from the national tournament.
Wow.
Yeah, which is really, it's really sad to see happen.
Yeah.
And so ever kind of since then, I've had these thoughts in the back of my head of how can we do this? What can we do? Because we have a lot of speech coaches, right? That sometimes will jump over into LD in an emergency situation or something. And if you look at them and you just say, well, the evidence isn't it's not cut correctly, blah, 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 they glaze over.
Right. Yeah.
Nothing is nothing. And so for enforcement, really, right, I think what we're trying to do is if you fabricate something, right, that is a clear ethics violation in academia. That is, and then I don't think we fully figured out if we want it to be it's an automatic loss in the round,
right,
if it's a removal from the tournament kind of thing, that is where we're still playing. How do we enforce it? How do we keep it universal? One of the questions, has been, well, since NFA says that in order to be able to be a qualifying tournament, you must follow all of NFA rules. And so let's say that a tournament complains, or someone complains about a tournament not enforcing the evidence rules, right?
Right.
There was a complaint made, no one says anything, or they say something and the tournament's meh.
Yeah.
What would happen? I don't have the answer for that.
Right.
Right. I'm not the NFA committee. It's not my job. And so, yeah, we're trying to work, what kind of language can we put in there? How do we not scare off speech only schools from things we're trying to police too much, right? Because they get a vote even if they don't have a debate team,
right? Because
they are part of NFA. And so their voices are also valuable in everything. So yes, the question of enforcement is a wonderful one.
It's tough. Because it kind of sometimes it gets away from you. You know what I mean? It's if you don't put it in the text, just like a good old policy debate round, you don't have it in there, it starts getting away from you. You know what I mean? And
well, there's also the question of responsibility, right? Not every team has students cutting cards. Some teams have coaches cutting cards. right? Some teams have graduate students cutting cards. If one of my students is handed a card by
Right.
somebody else on the team, should they be removed from a tournament because their teammate cut something out of context? I don't think so, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think that like there's a series of like complicating matters on a squad like chemistry here, like who's producing the evidence. Maybe I grabbed it off the wiki and the card was just cut out of context originally, and I just like was lazy, you know. That I think there's mitigating factors as well. So like having committees talk about these things, having a range of penalties, right? I think Shanna, the incident you were talking about, maybe have been the year that Colton won. Was that? Am I correct about that? Was 2017, maybe 2016? I don't know. It was like the year before I got there. I think that all happened.
I couldn't tell you who won that year. You think I barely remember who won last year.
Yeah.
Once the season ends, I forget it to the best of my ability.
But it seems like having only a tournament removal as the penalty seems pretty harsh, given that this isn't always the student's fault, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about like, you know, losing the round or that type of thing, kind of ranking up, scaling up the penalties. We had kind of toyed around with some of the concerns about like not everyone cuts their own evidence that they read, right? At the end of the day, though, at least in my perspective, we are all responsible individually for what we claim, you know, and so if that debater is using that piece of evidence and they find out that it was cut out of context, that sucks for them. But that's kind of that falls back on the team. Like that sucks for the whole team, right? Like maybe we all do better about cutting evidence from now on. Because there's no real way to say, like, otherwise we're just going to be passing the buck and like, oh, I didn't cut it, so-and-so cut it. And then what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I try to do when I think about like enforcing rules and why am I teaching this and what's the purpose of all this debate, I try to find close proximities to applications outside of debate. And if anyone were, you know, a spokesperson, they're working in PR, they're in charge of being the face, they're in charge of being the voice of something, even especially themselves, right? If you're a politician and you have a speechwriter hands you something, you can't say, oh, well, my speechwriter screwed up.
Exactly.
And it's like there's a level of accountability that if you're the one saying it, you got to take it on, even if you're not the one that cut it, you know? Yeah. So to some degree, that's tough though. Yes. That's tough. I mean, still, you got to find a balance. It's like, you know, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I always equate it to my students. I use the lawyer example of who had with AI making things up from his person.
Paralegals.
Thank you. But his paralegal, right, where the paralegal was trying to save time, AI hallucinated and was like, here's some precedent, and the judge was like, these are not real.
Oh my God. Oh, I love that story. I gotta find out the details on that story. Oh my God.
There was some crazy I can't remember if he got disbarred or not personally. I think he did.
Really? Oh my God.
I think they had all their previous decisions like that were done in that time frame also vacated.
Yep.
So they had won some victories or something like that, and they had those vacated. They had to retry it. Like it was a whole mess.
Yeah.
And I use the analogy that also a law enforcement type thing of like ignorance of the law doesn't make you innocent.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, and then one of my hopes is that it'll make the students read the freaking evidence before they go to a tournament. I mean, I know it's not going to solve it completely. It's a fight I've had since I was a debater. So, but you know, maybe if we can like be like, no, we actually have standards. We're going to, you know, actually expect you to be at these standards, which 99% of the time you already are.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, to be honest, it does happen. Yeah.
Right. Like it'll just maybe increase, you know, understanding of your evidence, reading the evidence, but not just relying on, you know, that, oh, Susie would never lie. Well, maybe Susie would never purposely lie and accidentally read something wrong, and so cut it incorrectly.
Well, and I also think that like having like some specific standards takes a little bit of the politics out of it.
Yes.
Right. Like we're not trying to use evidence standards as a tool to win debates or to get people out of tournaments. It's like, because I think that is how it can be seen when somebody makes an evidence challenge in a round. Oftentimes people frame that as, oh, you're just doing this to win a debate. And I think that like pointing out that like most people do this anyway. This is a very small number of cases. We're trying to provide some guidelines for when it does happen, so people don't like lose their minds over like, why is this process so political, right? Or why is this coming after my team or this team or something? There's oftentimes a feeling if you're being targeted, and I think these rule changes are intended to be the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And so that like the tournament committee doesn't have to sit there and play the, well, what does this very vague standard actually mean? And then they're stuck, adjudicating for hours like they were when this instance came up, trying to decide what do we do? What part of the bylaws does this apply to? And it was a very messy thing to watch from the outside. Like you just knew the tournament committee was like, oh. No.
Well, like in a judicial system, there's precedent, right? It's like you can actually quote case law, but we don't keep track of all the cases in NFA LD. You know what I mean? You only have black letter law. And so you got to write it in. You got to write it into the black letter. So, I mean, yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense. Well, I clearly still a little bit of a work in progress, but I think the principles that we're going for are great. I wanted to thank you for letting us know about the stuff that's going on behind the scenes at NFA LD. Shanna from Illinois, Shawna from Illinois. Thank you so much. As always, Justin, for this episode as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jared.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'll see everyone later.